So hello everyone and welcome to the second instalment of the University of Queensland Faculty of Health and Behavioural Sciences Alumni Webinar Series. My name is Paul Purcell. I work in our Alumni Relations team, and today we'll be joined by Professor Alex Haslam from the UQ School of Psychology. Alexander is Professor of Social and Organisational Psychology and Australian Laureate Fellow at the University of Queensland. His research focuses on the study of group and identity processes in organisational, social and clinical contexts. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners and their custodianship of the various different lands on which we're all meeting today. On behalf of the University, I pay our respects to their ancestors and their descendants who continue cultural and spiritual connections to country. We recognise their valuable contributions to Australian and global society. For those of you joining us live today, feel free to ask questions as we go along via the chat function, and we'll endeavour to get to those throughout or prior to conclusion. This webinar is also being recorded. It will be accessible via the HaBS Alumni page, which we'll send out in an email afterwards, which will also include the link to the other episodes within this series if you wanted to catch up or to look at what's coming up. And now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Alex Haslam.
Thanks very much, Paul, and thanks for the invitation to come and talk to you, and thanks to everybody for logging in today to this sort of gathering and this discussion. What I'm going to do is pretty informal, and for me, and I hope for you, the sort of key part of today is really going to be, if you like, the interaction around the issues that the points I'm going to make at the start raise. So I hope that what I'm going to do is provide a platform for a sort of an interesting Q&A there. But what I'm really going to try to do is really talk about or focus on the psychology of COVID-19, and I've just got one really PowerPoint slide. I'm going to just introduce this material with. So I'm going to share my screen now. Here we go. If I can share, here we go, and that should come up here. I think if it's here, let me have a look. View slideshow. Okay, here we are. Can I just check, Paul, you can see that? Is that all right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Brilliant. Okay. So what the sort of informal title I've given this talk, or this sort of webinar, is getting our heads around the we thing. And the focus for everything I'm really going to say is a book which my colleagues and I have been working on for the last 2 months. It's on the psychology of COVID-19, and it's called Together Apart. And there are 4 of us who've really worked on pulling the book together. Yolanda Yeton, who's my colleague, has the office next to me, in fact, in the psychology department at UQ. Steve Riker, who's a colleague at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. Tegan Cruis, who was formerly of the University of Queensland, but now at the Australian National University. And the book sort of brings together, it's got 20 chapters, I'll tell you a little bit about them later on, and we've got contributions then from a range of our colleagues around the world, they're all basically social or social organisational, social clinical psychologists, and they're working in a whole range of different fields. Some of them applied, some of them theoretical, some of them sort of, some of them research-based, and some of them just sort of standard academic positions. But this idea, as I said at the beginning, getting our heads around the we thing, the basic point that we make in the book is that psychologically speaking, if you're trying to understand pretty much any aspect of the psychology of COVID-19, most of the things that have been going on come back to issues of social identity or usness or weenus, okay? And actually that idea about getting your head around the we thing actually comes from it's a quote from Andrew Cuomo, the governor of New York, and he said at a key point, we started saying, it's not about me, it's about we. Get your head around the concept. It's not all about you, it's about me too. It's about we. So, and as I'm going to say, I think that sense of usness has actually is implicated in lots of different, perhaps even I'll go so far as to say pretty much all aspects of the psychology of the pandemic. So let's just talk through that very quickly what the kind of key argument there is. What we're saying is that one of the key things about this pandemic is that whereas we, going into it, I think lots of people were in lots of different spaces, and I think a lot of the psychology of the things that we might have been talking about was very much focused on the psychology of I, what makes us unique and different from other people. But I think the pandemic and the sense that goes with it of we're all in this together, and that we face or confront, potentially at least, a very similar set of realities, and things that affect you affect me, and that therefore, our own orientation to the world is seen through the lens, not just of I, but actually much more of we. So that the pandemic, to a certain extent, whether we like it or not, creates bonds between us, psychological bonds between us, and of a particular form, and that those have particular consequences. And as I said, the psychology of social identity, not that sense of usness, we argue is shot through most of the conversations that we're having around the pandemic, at least the behavior and psychology around it. So one of those, and in the book, there are kind of 4 core strands of research that we look to bring together. The first is really on social influence, and in particular, the section there really focuses on issues of leadership and followership and behavior change, and also things like conspiracy theories. So, I guess the core argument in that section is that leadership and effective leadership has revolved around leaders' capacity to mobilize a shared sense of social identity. I think going into this pandemic, I think, I think all sorts of leaders were on slightly shaky ground. I think that was true in Australia. But I think one of the things that you have seen in Australia, New Zealand, and other countries is leaders galvanizing people around that shared identity as Australians, rather than as Scott Morrison said, rather than as members of the red or the blue team, or as unions or bosses, getting everybody in the same tent and feeling that we're all pulling together has been critical for but for leadership, influencing people and getting them to do what one wants, to comply, for example, with regulations on physical distancing and the lockdown more generally, but also for getting people to sort of engage constructively with that sort of collective agenda. That revolves around leaders, as I say, creating that sense of shared identity, and then themselves being representative of it. So again, I think you see that particularly in Jacinda Ardern, you see that a lot in the Scandinavian countries' leadership, where I think leaders have done a really good job of connecting with their people as members of a common group. And conversely, in countries where leaders have had difficulty doing that, and I think the sort of obvious cases are the United States and Brazil, then you see that actually that mobilization hasn't been so successful, and it's had a lot of consequences in terms of not just compliance with health regulations, but obviously then the health consequences of the virus and the pandemic more generally. So I think there's a big social influence story. There's also a big social connection story. I early on, if any of you follow me on Twitter, I said, I think before we really got into this very far, I said, I think one thing that's going to really come out of this pandemic, it's going to shed light on how important social connections are for us. So a lot of things that prior to the pandemic we might have taken for granted about the importance of social connections and group life for our health and well-being, like our connection to our workmates, our connections to our communities. Once those things are sort of threatened or taken away, we realize how important they are for our equanimity, our well-being, and our health. And that's one of the things that we explore in quite considerable depth in the book. That section's really led by Tegan, but it has contributions from several people at UQ, including in the psych department, including Sarah Bentley and Kath Haslam, and also Katie Greenaway, who was formerly in the school. They're looking at different aspects of that. Kath, for example, focuses on the particular implications of isolation, social disconnection brought about by the pandemic for older adults. And obviously that's a huge issue in the present, but I think it's likely to be a huge issue kind of going forward. And actually, one of the things I'm an advisor for the ABC's COVID Monitor project. And in that data, what you see is over time, there has been increased anxiety around physical disconnection from other people. That's brought with it a somewhat increased sense of loneliness. And if anyone's ever heard me talk before, you know that, well, loneliness has very profound health consequences. And again, I think, out of this pandemic, I think, one of the things we've seen is the importance of connection for health, but also the ways in which, when it's compromised or threatened, that's kind of problematic. One other point that I've sort of made in that context, which I think is, or that we've made, is that there's a lot of discussion around the sort of mental health crisis, as it were, that Australia is facing and other countries at the moment. And I think our point would be, well, it's not so much that we have a mental health crisis as we've got a social reality crisis that has mental health consequences. So a lot is going to depend on how we manage that social reality and how we are able to manage our social connections going forward. And the critical point I would make, and this is coming through in lots of the data, that ABC data I talked about, but other surveys that we have been running, is that actually at the moment, the sense of solidarity between Australians in particular is very high. And I would argue that is a critical resource for health. And that's it's going to be incredibly important that we maintain this sense of solidarity, this sense of being in it together as we move forward. The interesting thing there too is I don't think that's just relevant for health. I actually think it's going to be incredibly important for the sort of social and political fabric of society. I think lots of people have commented that one of the positive things about the pandemic is that it has revived, I think, a sense of Australian community and a sense of shared Australian identity in ways that have been positive. I think coming out of the pandemic, I think we're going to face a whole range of threats, if you like, to that, in economic threats, other related sorts of threats to do with hardship, but also I think in particular, I think people are going to have very different experiences post-pandemic as a function of where they are in society. Particularly, I think the evidence from other pandemics is that they accentuate social inequality. So I do think a huge issue for leadership is going to be making sure that sense of all being in it together, which has been so important for our ability to control the pandemic, is preserved as we move forward, and that we really take steps to ensure that we don't go back to and indeed an accentuated sense of social division and divisiveness. And as I say, I think that is going to be a critical issue for policymakers and for leaders. But I think the other thing too is that our data show, and this comes through in different forms, that actually people value that connectedness, and they recognize its value, and they want a society which is characterized by a fair go and equality rather than inequality. So a big question I think going forward is going to be how that plays out, how that shared identity is managed, how it's nurtured, and whether, I think in particular, people who are more disadvantaged or more vulnerable for whatever reason feel that they are being included in the broader tent of activity within society as a whole. And the other, I think, piece there, which is the final chapter of the book, which Yolanda's been leading on, is really the obvious other point, if we look at a sort of in a global sense, is that lots of the stories now starting to come out around the virus, or around intergroup relations, in particular, relations between the US and China and other countries and so on. And it's very clear that there are a lot of sensitives around the sort of us-them dynamics, which have emerged as a consequence of the pandemic. So while the virus, I think, has done a good job of binding us together as Australians. I think too, and you see this in the global sort of theatre too, that in a particular way it's been associated with sort of particular divisions. And whereas you might have hoped that the virus would like bring all nations together under the umbrella of a shared social identity as members of humanity, I think to date there has been relatively little evidence of that, and that's of course partly a function again of I think of the actions of some of the bigger global actors there, who for whatever reason have been not as enthusiastic about building that sense of all societies being in this together. And I think that's related to local concerns. I think if you take the case of the US, I think it's clear, for example, that the Republican strategy going into the 2020 election is basically around a sort of a US-China division, which in a certain sense, it's in their interests to heighten, accentuate, and consolidate in particular ways that I think will have very particular consequences as I think the sort of what you might call like phases 2 and 3 of the pandemic play out. So again, in the book, and one thing to say is when it's published, it's going to be freely available, the sort of e-version of it. So it should be widely accessible. We've written it with a view to it being engaging, accessible, and sort of readable, and sort of informative at the same time. For us, a key point is that these topics that we're talking about here, I think they're all discussed. I'm a pretty keen devourer of the news, both print and on television. All of these things are talked about all the time, but very, very little of the conversation really makes the connections between these different elements. They're all treated as if they were isolated things, isolated phenomena. And what we argue in the book, and actually we've argued in other research, is that isn't the case. They're all interconnected, and they all center on these issues of a shared social identity. And so I think going forward, we need to be sensitive to that. And most of the questions that we're going to be asking, I think, of ourselves as members of society, and are going to be asked of us by our leaders, relate to what we want that social identity to be, and what we want it to look like, and how indeed we position particular versions of we in relation to other groups, other communities in the world at large. So again, I think this is the agenda. I think there's lots of things which point towards it, and our goal is really to have input into that conversation, to provide some structure to it in ways that I think allow for the development of sound, social health, public policy, and actually all of us on the book are working with government and other agencies in a sort of an advisory capacity, and I think I think governments, policymakers recognise that now, as probably at no point, certainly in our recent history, there is a real need and appetite for I think high quality, deep psychological understanding of these issues. And our sense is that the sort of perspective that we and our colleagues provide on these topics, is a really important part of that of that discussion. But again, this isn't just a discussion that we want to have, with members of the academic community, or indeed just with policymakers. We want to have it with, the public at large. And I think we need in Australia and around the world, we need informed debate around these issues, and we see our responsibility, I think, as scientists, as being to contribute to that debate, and making sure that we're putting something out there which is both evidence-based but also practical. But as I say, it's in the spirit of that I really welcome your questions, the points of interest for you, and again, I really encourage you when the book comes out to read it and to use that as a stimulus for your own thinking and discussions with other people. Just to say, these are the topics in the book, and so again, if there are things there that sort of you want to know more about, and you want to ask questions about, please do. But you see that goes there's leadership, compliance, behavior change, conspiracy theories I talked about, group threat, risk perception, social isolation, aging and connectedness, collective trauma, crowds, emergencies and disasters, solidarity, managing crowds, social order and disorder, inequality, polarization, prejudice and racism, and then common identity. So I'll leave it there and I'll open this up to your questions. But again, thanks very much for inviting me to do this. And again, I look forward to answering them. But again, I look forward to the opportunity to have more of these discussions as we move forward.
Thank you, Alex. Just a question to get us started on there. On the social connection topic, you spoke about people taking advantage of things prior to this whole COVID situation emerging. Do you think we'll see a boost in people joining clubs or teams or societies after this that potentially may not have felt the need to have done so beforehand?
I think that's a really interesting question. I would say, actually, we've got some quite nice data on this. I think people's motivation to connect is very high. I think people recognize the importance of those things. What we're seeing at the moment is, in pretty much equal measure, there's a certain trepidation around a lot of those things. Like in the ABC data, something like only 17 or 15% of people would feel comfortable going to a football match, for example, or attending a meeting in which there was any sort of concentration of people. So I think, we want to do all of those things again, but insofar as a lot of those things center around sort of, relatively intense face-to-face contact, I think there's a sort of an apprehension there too. And I think that's one of the interesting things around the psychology of the virus, is that you've got this push and pull, in very uneasy coexistence. So you really feel the need of a lack of social connection at the same time that you understand that social connection brings with it a whole raft of problems. And so I think the management of that is going to be sort of absolutely critical. And I think structuring that and giving people the opportunities to connect as much as possible in the safest way possible, at least in the short term, is going to be critical. But yeah, I think we've got lots of evidence that, people are really missing often just those mundane social interactions, group-based interactions that they'd really taken for granted before. And that's coming through particularly in those more vulnerable populations, like older adults, particularly, for example, people who are in care, and I think, disabled people and so on. So I think it's a huge issue. And again, I think we're going to have to be making a lot of investment there, but I think there's going to be a lot of appetite for sort of uptake in that space. And I would also say that attention to that has to be part of not just a sort of well-being agenda, it has to be part of a health agenda, because we know that those things have a very, very profound impact on health. And actually, anybody who heard me talk before knows that, one of the things that was coming through in the epidemiological data in Australia was that there was a bit of a sort of an epidemic of loneliness. So we were already in a bit of a bad space on that. I think this has accentuated that, but I think it's made more people aware of that as a critical issue. And I think that's a good thing, insofar as we are able to then use that as a catalyst for other kind of investments, if you like.
Excellent. I've got a question that's been sent through from one of our attendees as well, saying, and I'll read it, "We might all be in the same storm, but it's increasingly obvious we're not all sailing in similar boats. For example, some people find themselves in dinghies and others in yachts. How can social identity help mend this divide in the long term?"
I think, that is an absolutely critical observation. And again, I think that is, as I've said, I think one of the things we know from other pandemics and sort of natural disasters like that is, firstly, that to the extent there is inequality, that in the absence of any intervention, the pandemic will exacerbate those things. Okay, so but we also have data from other, disasters of various forms that actually in this situation too, societies can go in sort of two directions. They can use the disaster as a catalyst for coming together and closing those gaps, or they can sort of sail on regardless and pretend that there isn't anything going on there. And I don't, firstly, so what can social identity do is, I think one thing is it can help us, firstly, the data can alert us to those things and those realities as they unfold, but also make the point that leadership and what we call identity leadership, which is precisely about managing intra-group, intra-societal relations between groups, is all about modeling the right way forward there, the ways that, again, make sure that we all do it, hang in this together. And I think actually, again, if we don't do that, then I think we're going to find on pretty much every measure, economic, social, health, you know, we're in for really, really choppy, you know, waters. So I think, you know, all the evidence is that now is a time to kind of double down on making sure that we're bringing everybody with us. And, you know, and as you say, if people are in dinghies and they got leaks in them, we need to be investing very heavily in fixing those leaks. This is, you know, I think there was a very good conversation on the drum yesterday. You know, now is a very, very good time to be investing in social housing, for example. You know, people who are homeless or needy or disadvantaged. Aside from just the economic stimulus there, we need to be sending very strong signals to people who are struggling that we care about them. You know, and that's something obviously for everyone in the community to be interested in doing that. But it's, I think, a particular prerogative, a responsibility for those in leadership positions. And I, you know, I'd like to think that this is something they understand too. I think pretty much across the political spectrum, there has been renewed recognition of the value of solidarity, the value of shared identity. And actually, I think as Australians came together to sort of fight the pandemic, I think that was a very clear recognition that was made possible by our sense of responsibility to each other, not, as it were, just our responsibility to ourselves. So, you know, I think there's reason to be I think there's reason to think that we can negotiate this. We can certainly do it better or worse. And again, our research is really about understanding whether we are, but also pointing out what the value of doing that is, and giving people an example of how they might do it. But again, this is going to be a work in progress too.
Fantastic. All right. Just before we wrap up, I just wanted to touch on a little bit further about the book that you've mentioned that's coming out. Is there anything further you can tell us about that, when we can expect to possibly see that, where we'd be able to access it?
Well, we're hoping to submit it. We've got to submit it on Monday, so so that's uppermost in our minds. I think it'll take them a couple of months to process it and stuff, because it's going through an academic publisher, Sage, in London. I guess we will put out media on that as we move forward. I know I see Danny from the press office is in on this session, and I know we'll be working with her to promote it. But as I say, I'm optimistic that because it's free, there'll be a certain amount of publicity that goes with it, and we're already doing quite a lot of sort of media stuff around that. So we'll be working hard to get it out there. But I guess if you just put in our names and the thing Together Apart and Sage, you'll see whether it's coming up. But also, if you look in our Twitter feeds, we'll have more news about that as it develops. Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Professor Alex Haslam. It's been an absolute fascinating half an hour. It's a great opportunity to listen to your mind on such an important and relevant topic.
Okay, good. Yeah, good. Okay, well, I hope people found it stimulating. And again, I hope we have the opportunity for many more of these conversations in the months and years ahead. And also, too, I should say, too, I think a lot of people who've heard me or Yolanda or my colleagues talk before will have heard us talking about this too. And hopefully, in a way, this is kind of useful because it shows how that body of knowledge that we've been working on for like 3 decades can be brought to bear in a sort of practical and useful way on this, you know, obviously very pressing set of issues.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much once again. And
thank you.
All those who have joined us today. We'll send out an email with a link to this video if you'd like to watch it again, and also with some details. I'll include Alex's Twitter feed on there so you can link in with that and stay connected.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thanks everybody for coming along.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye.